Welcome back to State of the Association. I'm your host, Nash Roberts. We've got some fun stuff to talk about today, stuff I'm really passionate about, actually. Jimmy Butler is reportedly fond of joining the Brooklyn Nets in the 2025 offseason. Shaquille O'Neal called Rudy Gobert the worst NBA player of all time. Kyle Kuzma said that the LA Lakers would still be championship contenders if they did not move on from him. And Jamal Murray just signed a 4-year, $208 million contract extension with the Denver Nuggets. Welcome back to State of the Association. I've got to defend Rudy Gobert a little bit. Shaq the other day, one of the greatest big men of all time, called Rudy Gobert the worst player of all time. And Rudy, he catches a lot of flack for his play because in the modern NBA, we see so many great offensive talents at the center position, guys who can move like a guard. You got a guy like Wemby, 7'4". He's not as smooth as a guy like the top echelon, like, say, Kyrie or Paul George. But Wemby, he can handle the rock better than pretty much any big has before him. And you see an influx of talented bigs like that can move almost like a guard. And then you see Rudy Gobert, and he's the opposite of that. He doesn't take three-pointers. He lives in the paint, and he locks down on D, and is just more of a connecting piece on the offensive end. And that's pretty much all he is. He does it efficiently, but he doesn't take too many shots either. He's not the most aggressive offensive player you've ever seen, that's for sure. And that's okay. Rudy Gobert is a very valuable player in the modern NBA, and he shows that you can go against the grain and be able to still impact the game at a high level. He catches a lot of flack for being, he's not really that good a defender. He shouldn't be a 4-time DPOY. Look at the Utah Jazz teams in the playoffs. They fell apart. You know why? Because Rudy Gobert had no defenders with him on that Jazz team. You can look at the roster. It's just led by guys. They might be good on offense, but they can't hold a candle to what a guy like Rudy Gobert does defensively. So he has to carry the load, not just in the post, but on the perimeter as well. And he's a solid perimeter defender for a big man. He's not Marcus Smart. He's not Drew Holiday. And he doesn't need to be, because his role, his bread and butter, is in the post. And so if you hate on him for his perimeter defense, you're missing the whole point of what he brings to a team. He can take a horrible defensive roster and turn that into a top 5 defense in the league. He was the leader of one of the best defenses we have seen in recent memory, maybe all time, for this past year's Minnesota Timberwolves. Rudy Gobert is a very valuable player in today's NBA because of defense alone. And talking about the Timberwolves team, one play that he caught a lot of flack for was when he was guarding Luka Doncic and Luka hit a step-back three. No one in the league is guarding that. There's a very select few guys in the league who are going to guard that. And Rudy Gobert, he did all right for what he had. He, just due to his wingspan, he was able to contest it a little bit, and most guys can't even do that on Luka Doncic. So the fact that he was even able to put up a little bit of a contest on a Luka Doncic step-back three while being a post-centric player is very impressive. So I think Rudy, a lot of time we miss the plot entirely when it comes to his defense and what he brings to a team. Because he deserves his 4 DPOYs. He is one of the greatest defenders that we have ever seen. He has been the anchor of great defensive units that wouldn't have been able to do without him. Now, the Minnesota Timberwolves, you can make a little bit of an argument for that. But that's another thing, because he's really showed his value this past year and still gets a lot of hate. But he really showed his value in what he can be, because the Minnesota Timberwolves, they're the opposite of that Utah Jazz, those old Utah Jazz teams, because they have so many guys that can defend. Anthony Edwards, Jaden McDaniels is one of the best two-way players in the entire league. Mike Conley's solid. Cat's there. He's got size on him at least. I can give him that. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, one of my favorite players in the entire league to watch. There's Naz Reid. There's such great defensive talent and just general talent on that team that Rudy, he's really able to impact the game best as a defender when he's just, sent to the post and goes to work. And he doesn't have the block numbers of a guy like Wemby, sure. But he doesn't need to. Guys are scared to go to the rim because Rudy Gobert is guarding it. So he is one of the most impactful defenders we have ever seen. one of the greatest defenders of all time, and he catches a lot of hate. Shaq called him the worst NBA player of all time. That couldn't be further from the truth. It's time we put some respect to talk about who doesn't impact the game as much as Gobert, for sure, especially on the defensive end, and that is Kyle Kuzma. He came out recently and said that the Lakers would still be contending for titles if he was not traded, and that they made a mistake by giving up on him. I disagree with this for an array of reasons. Kyle Kuzma, ultimately, I think he wanted out. Really, he wanted to have his own show because Kuz, as solid as he can be as a scorer, he's not great at playmaking for others. So, as a role player, as the third option, he doesn't really succeed as well in that role as he would the first option. And as the first option, you're not going to get that far with Kyle Kuzma. But at the very least, Kuz is able to put up numbers. He's going to get his money. He's going to be the face of a team over in Washington, right? So I think, for the most part, that Kuz, he kind of wanted out of Washington. So now, maybe he's a little bit bitter about that. But I think overall, as a player, Washington is better for him because LA, their star duo is forwards. So there's less of a place for Kyle Kuzma. I guess AD is power forward / center, but you get the idea. There's less of a place for Kyle Kuzma on that roster anyways. And yes, he was part of that 2020 title team. But in general, Kuz, I think what he brings to the table is widely replaceable. You can find a lot of scoring wings in the modern NBA, and they might not be the most efficient. They might not be the best playmakers for others. They might not be able to play well within a system that's designed to win a championship, where they're, say, the third option, the fourth option, really a role player. Tobias Harris comes to mind, right? But that's what Kyle Kuzma was. So I don't think the Lakers would be in a different position if they had Kyle Kuzma. And I think their roster right now, it's on paper set up as good as it has been since that title run, because the year after that the year after that it's set up the best it has been since the year after that, because the Dennis Schroeder Montrezl Harrell experiment, I was excited for that. I thought it was going to be a lot better than it was, because those are the top 2 6-men of the year before, and then they come to LA and they're just marred by injuries. They end up being a 7 seed. LeBron lost in the first round for the first time in his career. But other than that, this LA roster, I think, has been the best fit in terms of players and play style since that championship run. And that's because you've got a backcourt that can be complementary to the star duo in LeBron James and AD. D'Lo, I like him a lot as a third option. I think really he could be a very good piece on a lot of teams. His defense obviously isn't the greatest, but he's a great offensive engine. He can shoot the rock very well. He's perimeter threat, great playmaker, and he's not the best in the playoffs. He's had his struggles there, but I believe that he will at some point be able to turn the corner and at least have one good playoff series for his whole career. It's bound to happen at some point, right? Because D'Lo, he's a guy that has been able to show up in clutch moments before the lights, when it's not the playoffs, aren't too bright. Like, I remember, I'm a Minnesota Timberwolves fan. Just the other year, it was against Philly, I believe. He had 27 points in the fourth quarter and overtime combined, and led us to victory in that game. And I didn't have League Pass at the time. I paid $1 to watch the fourth quarter in OT while the game was going on, because he's just an exciting player to watch. And when he's hot, he's on one. And so I believe that he can be valuable to this team, even though he's a little bit streaky, he's a little bit inconsistent. D'Lo is still a positive player to have. Austin Reeves, people said he's the third best player on that team. I disagree. I think that's definitively D'Angelo Russell. However, if people are having conversations about that, then you're doing something right. Austin, I think he is better for a role than D'Lo is. D'Lo, he kind of wants to be the primary, a higher priority in terms of ball handling. Austin Reeves plays his role a little bit more. He can play more off ball. He has his moments defensively more than D'Angelo Russell does. I still don't consider him to be much of a defender, but he can have moments where he's pretty solid. He's a good hustle player and good lunch pail guy to have in the locker room. Rui Hachimura, I think on a championship team, Rui Hachimura is a more impactful player than Kyle Kuzma is, because Rui can be a really good play finisher. He's athletic, and his counting stats aren't going to be as much as a guy like Kuz, but Kyle Kuzma demands the ball in his hands more. Rui Hachimura can play more off ball. He can play solid defense. I think Hachimura and overall this Lakers roster, they're really more fit for championship contention, and I don't really know how much of a contender they are, especially in that loaded Western Conference. I think they're more of a contender than they would be if they had Kyle Kuzma right now. So I disagree with his statements overall. I think Kyle Kuzma can be a solid player in this league, but right now I think he's in the best spot he really can be, where he gets to be the number one option and just go out there and get some baskets. It doesn't matter how efficient you are; they don't have winning expectations over time. Jamal Murray signed a 4-year, $208 million contract extension, $50 million a year for a guy who has never been an All-NBA, never been an All-Star. I think Jamal Murray, what he brings to the team is good for the Denver Nuggets, and he's solid in the regular season. Sometimes he'll have good playoff runs. Last year was kind of forgettable, but the year before he was pretty good. I don't think he's worth $50 million a year, though, and I don't think that should be a particularly hot take. You're paying him with some of the highest paid guys in the league today, making a lot of money for a point guard who I think his production can be replaced. In the playoffs, you can argue how he's a very valuable player. This past playoff run wasn't all that stellar for him. And you can make the argument that was because they were playing a great defensive team in the Minnesota Timberwolves in the second round. But just in general, I think Jamal Murray isn't as great a player as a lot of times he's perceived, and especially by the Denver Nuggets fan base. And just Jamal Murray, I'm not a fan of the deal. I'm not a fan of his play. I think his regular season production is pretty easily replaceable. And I think in the playoffs, yeah, he's a solid little riser. But why not take a chance on another guy who's going to cost a little bit less, who can give you the same production in the regular season, and maybe we haven't seen him in the playoffs before, or he's also a playoff riser? Because you could find a guy like that. There's plenty of solid point guards in the NBA today that can fit within a role on an offense in the playoffs, especially. Because Jamal, I think the main two-man game of the Nuggets that I like the most in terms of how they play off of each other is Nikola Jokic and Aaron Gordon. Jamal Murray, I consider him, I would say, the third best player on that team. And in terms of value, I've always said that the Denver Nuggets are, at least until they lost KCP, they were the most well-constructed roster, starting five in the NBA, because you had a solid point guard in Jamal Murray. You had a lights-out shooter in MPJ. You had a great role player in KCP. You had the best two-man game in the league between a great play finisher and one of the most unique offensive talents we've ever seen in the NBA, perhaps the greatest offensive talent for a big we have ever seen, Nikola Jokic. Him and Aaron Gordon have a great two-man duo. So really, you could make the argument that Jamal Murray is the third or fourth most important player on that team, because really, MPJ, what he brings to the table as a shooter, you can't replace his shooting production by mostly anyone. And Jamal, I think what he brings to the table is a little bit more replaceable. And I get the city of Denver loves him, and that's all right. He's a championship point guard. I can appreciate him for what he is, but I don't think $52 million a year is a good move for Jamal Murray. And I'm sure his family is happy he got that max extension. I'm sure he's happy, but I don't know how much is worth it. And if his play declines, because over internationally we didn't see much good from him for Team Canada. If he comes in next season, he's rusty and not shooting well, and all of a sudden Jamal Murray, he takes a step down from what he had been, and what he had been was just kind of solid and stable, nothing extraordinary. If he comes into next season and isn't the same player that he was in the NBA the past couple of years even, all of a sudden that contract looks even worse. So I don't like the move. I'm just not a big DeJounte Murray fan, and I don't want to let it bleed into that so much. I just think in terms of his impact on the team and the production he has, I don't think he's worth 4 years, $208 million. good on him for getting that money. But in general, Jimmy Butler is fond of joining the Brooklyn Nets in the 2025 free agency cycle. I'm not sure how I feel about this. I feel like Jimmy Butler, the Miami Heat are the perfect place for him. He's led them to the championship 2 times, although they haven't won either of those. But he's been really good for them. And I think Jimmy embodies Heat culture. It's all, Heat culture kind of becomes a meme at some points just because, people talk about, well, the Miami Heat, they might be the 8th seed, but watch out for them, and then they go on to maybe not do anything in the playoffs that year. But in general, I think the Miami Heat have cultivated a good culture and just have good work ethic with their players. Everybody's locked in. They're going to do all they can on the defensive end. They're just all in, trying to do the best that they can to win games and be a quality team, despite, maybe not having the most talent on paper or having the most esteemed players. A guy like Caleb Martin really shows up and out in the playoffs. And so I think Jimmy Butler is a good example of that as well. His first couple years in Chicago, he might have averaged two points a night, but now he's multiple-time All-Star. He's the number 1 option on that team. And so I think Miami was the perfect spot for Jimmy, and I would love to see him retire as a Miami Heat player because I think he just embodies the culture of that city and the basketball team so well. But now let's talk actually about, what the Brooklyn Nets would be doing. I disagree with it entirely. I think that it is a lateral move to go from trading away Mikal Bridges to which after that, I think it's time to go for a rebuild, right? And then to go to another forward who can score, who can defend, and Jimmy Butler. And I guess, Jimmy has more experience being the first option, absolutely. But in general, I don't think this is not league altering for the Brooklyn Nets whatsoever. I saw someone in the comments on Run Basketball say, hey, Cam Thomas, Nick Claxton, and Jimmy Butler, they get a stable point guard. That's a really solid team. And then all the comments were saying, for 30 wins to be the 12th seed. And I agree with that mostly because I don't think that what he could offer you with the way this roster is currently constructed is much better than what a guy like Mikal Bridges was able to offer you. And Jimmy's a better player, sure. Mikal is much more widely accepted and much better as a role player than being the first option, especially compared to Jimmy. He's a much better first option than Mikal could be. But in general, I don't think it moves the needle. So I think the Brooklyn Nets really are better served to rebuild. And honestly, if this came out last year, I would have liked the idea of it a lot more because a lot of people said when the Brooklyn Nets, they had Mikal Bridges, they had everyone on that roster still. The general consensus around the league was that, this is a great team, a great conglomerate of role players. They need a guy that's going to take it to that next level. And Brooklyn still has a lot of good role players, don't get me wrong, but I think Mikal Bridges as the second option to say a guy like Jimmy would be so much better served than Jimmy with a guy like Dennis or Cam Thomas. Cam Thomas being second option. And then, I think Cam Thomas would be a better third option just because of his inconsistency. So I think Jimmy, the roster would be a better fit for him if it was last year than going into the next free agency offseason. So I don't like the move in terms of where it's at now because I think after the Brooklyn Nets trade away Mikal Bridges, that means it's time to rebuild because if you had Mikal, you could try to bring in a star, I believe, and then you could talk about maybe being a fringe contender. But now without Mikal, I think it's a lot more questionable, and I think it's just time to go into a full rebuild. I wouldn't like the move for Jimmy Butler, the Miami. Thank you for listening. As always, I'm your host, Nash Roberts. This has been State of the Association.